My day job is a filmmaker, and I'd made a film about climate change on the African continent, three territories really. KwaZulu-Natal, what was happening to small-scale agriculture there. Mali, the problems with the Sahel and the shifting climate zones and what that was doing to small-scale farmers. And finally, Kenya, Lake Turkana, which has been shrinking over the last 30 years and has been leading to warfare over grazing territory for goats and other domesticated livestock. And it left me with a very deep impression to see how many ordinary fishermen walking around with machine guns and utterly destitute refugee communities. What you're about to hear is some of it is pretty shocking, and it's very important that we begin to come to terms with the grief many of us are feeling about the potentiality of what lies ahead. I mean, I personally went through quite a bit of grief just a few months ago when the whole city in Mozambique was, there's not much left of it. It's unrecognizable. 500,000 homes were lost. Grief is welcome here. It's a very important part of the process of coming to terms with what we're facing if we are to be able to act. The cautionary principle that science adopts says if there's a risk, don't take it. So science has been quite conservative. What you hear down the pub from a scientist is quite different from what you're going to see in a reviewed paper, a peer-reviewed paper. It's going to have to be even more rigorous when you're looking at a whole number of sets of data, when you're looking at an area of climate science. And when you get to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is saying some very scary things, it becomes even more conservative. Now, people have been called alarmists for cherry-picking the worst-case scenarios. Key papers and the latest data is this talk, which we think in XR is very useful. Then you've got the IPC Panel 3. Now there you've got policymakers and economists, representatives of all the governments in the world and very powerful governments. And they make sure what the IPC says is often diluted. And many scientists feel that this is scandalous, that they're having scientific data and conclusions edited by politicians. This is a highly politicized panel. Now, this is one IPCC graph, just to give you an example. Just look at what this is saying to us. This is a graph. That blue line is the ice. And it shows you the black line is how they see on incrementally based climate modeling what is happening to the sea ice. The data shows us something very different. We're losing the Arctic sea ice at a tremendously fast rate. We are now at the position of where the climate modeling of the IPC says we're basically 2055, 2060. You see the line, the yellow line that I've marked. We're 40 years ahead of the predictions in terms of the data. We know what else we're looking at. Raging fires for the last 3 months in Russia, in the Arctic regions of Russia, Greenland, and Siberia, providing clouds, black clouds the size of Europe. A very respected climate scientist, advisor to the Pope, Angela Merkel, and the European Union. What he says in his paper, what lies beneath the understatement of existential climate risk is scary. He says, climate policy making has become embedded in a policy of failure and scientific reticence. This slide, the black line, again, is the data. The yellow line, which goes straight down, is the IPCC, or the linear notion of incremental climate change. The black line, is the data. Essentially, this sort of data is leading many climate scientists around the world to say the Arctic sea ice will be completely gone within the next 3 years or so. Okay. So what are the tipping points? What are some of the tipping points? We're looking at the probability and the possibility of a domino cascade of tipping points. So the Arctic is just one. Ocean sinks is another. The oceans will only take so much heat before we start seeing the release of methane from the ocean floor. We're in serious endgame situation if that goes fast. The Amazon dieback, the amount of plants, the boreal forest dieback. We're seeing the emergence of insects because of the warmer temperature now, which are killing off forests, which are killing off our carbon sinks. We're seeing warm currents of wind being pushed to the Antarctica, and with the potential to unsettle the ice shelves. I've just come back from India. Half of the country is being flooded because of the way the monsoons are coming down at the moment. We know what Bolsonaro is trying to do in Brazil with the Amazon, to put a motorway through it to clear space for cattle ranching. We're now at a situation where we're just over 1 degree. It's been rising at 0.17 centigrade per decade, but the rises now will no longer be linear. They are no longer linear. You can see from this Met Office graph how it's rising rapidly. These projections are coming from the University of Washington, that now, and UN warming estimates, there's only 1% chance of reaching 1.5. Now let's look at some of those consequences. These red areas are all the big cities on our coastal lands. We have a massive percentage of the world's population living in coastal cities. We have 20% of our population dependent on nutrition from the oceans. People, again, some scientists are talking about the possibility of that happening if we are unable to control our temperatures to, again, by 2050. I mean, look, 140 million people. Another study, up to 1 billion people affected. These cities will be lost or destroyed beyond recognition. London will lose half of its land mass. South London, south of the River Thames, will be gone. We're facing an ecological crisis of tremendous proportions. Much of it, or if not most of it, to do with climate change. We know what's happening. If you live in Johannesburg, that's 3 years of your life gone. Because of the air pollution. I think we're number 16th in the world. The worst, I think the worst is Delhi. Johannesburg comes 16th after that. We know the dust pollution from mining. We know the massive problems we've got with plastics and chemicals, and that many of our rivers, particularly in the mining areas in the north of the country, are already as good as dead. Soil erosion, we've been suffering from for years because of our people have been held up in the former Bantustans. Deforestation and habitat loss. Africa is suffering the worst from deforestation. The rate of deforestation in Africa is the highest of any continent at the moment, and it's rapid. This is what Dr. Marcia McNutt has to say. Climate change and other ecological pressures, even the most optimistic predictions, are dire. She's from the National Academy of Sciences, the former editor-in-chief of the prestigious journal Science. We're facing other pressures related to climate change. And that acidification of the oceans is considered the evil twin of climate change. But scientific knowledge tells us that we have faced 5 mass extinctions. People would have seen some of the latest reports: wildlife dying out due to habitat destruction, overhunting, toxic pollution, invasion by alien species, and climate change. The ultimate cause of all these factors is, in quotes, overpopulation and overconsumption by the rich, especially by the rich. 1 in 4 species are at risk of extinction. 40% of all amphibians. 34% of the conifers, the trees. 33% of the coral reef. 31% of sharks and rays, and the list goes on. 25% of all mammals. I mean, it's shocking what we've done. Now, look at the possibility here. 1 in 20 chance that the 2.2 trillion tons of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere could cause an existential warming threat. That's what we presently have. It's not what is projected to be emitted. There is a 1 in 20 chance. That is where we've taken our world, our planet. 1.5 centigrade is considered dangerous. That is the new limits set by Paris and the UN, the IPCC. 3 centigrade is considered as catastrophic. And we're looking at that at the moment by 2050. That may change, as we say. 5 centigrade, we can only hazard a guess again, but this includes the loss of most human life on our planet. It's estimated by some that maybe a few 100 million will survive, possibly as many as 1 billion. But we will see 6 billion lives lost. Would you put your children on an aeroplane which has a 1 in 20 chance of crashing? You wouldn't. None of us would. Would you put your brother or baby sister on a aeroplane with a 1 in 20 chance of crashing? That is where we are now at. This is some of the stuff I've been reading lately. This guy has got 400,000 downloads of his paper. It's a 180-page paper. It's a review of all the climate science, and it was published in 2018. Societal collapse. In many ways, we know what societal collapse looks like in southern Africa. We've got a 10 to 20% reduction in our grain production already. Prices are going up, unemployment is going up, peasant agriculture is suffering because of the inability to predict rainfall. We're having tremendous pressure on our cities. The possible mechanism that he talks about leading to societal collapse in 3 years' time is what's happening with the jet stream in the Arctic. There's some very worrying data coming out of what's happening there. We've seen what this has done to the European weather this year and last year. 40 centigrade in places in Europe. We need to be making plans for both mitigation and adaptation. Very important, and this is part of the XR platform. It's just not about direct action and protesting, but it's also about beginning to build our resilience in society to quick, sharp shocks which may be created along the way. Look at this story. It's incredible. This guy gets invited to address the club of the super rich. 5 super rich guys pay him half of his annual salary to come and address them. They're not really interested in what he's talking about, you know, this sort of housing structure, this futuristic housing structure. They want to know what he knows about climate change. They'd come with their own questions. Which region will be less impacted by the climate crisis? New Zealand or Alaska? Finally, the CEO of the brokerage house explained that he had nearly completed his own building underground bunker system and asked, how do I maintain authority over my security force after the event? These are what the super rich are thinking. They're planning. We need to plan too. These sorts of shocks, which you'll see massive price increases for basic commodities like bread and pup and so on, are the breeding ground for fascism. Continuing nationalism, disdain for human rights, supremacy of the military, rampant sexism, controlling the mass media, obsession with national security, disdain for intellectuals and the arts, obsession with crime and punishment, rampant cronyism and corruption, and fraudulent elections. What is our government policy? 91% of our energy is based, and the coal lobby is active. And what are they saying? They're saying, actually, 700,000 jobs are related to coal, direct and indirect. And renewables is only 28,000. And we've got a massive unemployment problem. So what is this renewable energy lobby actually on about? Because jobs is our critical thing. We need coal because we need jobs. This is what they're saying. This was what in the Business Day just the other day. You'll see more of it in the Business Day to come as we begin to ramp up our direct action and pressure on our government. Growth is predicated on coal, gas and oil exploration. Fracking. We know what Grady Montash is saying. He's uber. He's pumped up about the prospects of mineral commodity extraction in South Africa and seeing that as a way to kickstart us out of our very low growth rates. Nuclear is still on the agenda. Sasol and Eskom are part of the top 100 companies responsible for 70% of the world's pollution. South Africa is responsible for the vast majority of Africa's pollution. It's likely not to meet its emission targets committed to at Paris 2015, according to my latest reading. Facing reality, there's a lack of concrete action. 28 years ago was the first IPCC report. They've warned us to keep temperatures below 1 centigrade or face societal collapse. 60% higher the CO2 levels than in 1990. Methane, even more so worrying. At some point, we're going to be in a situation where we cannot reverse the situation. The problem will run away with us, run away from us, and this is what's abrupt climate change. We're saying, oh, there's carbon capture technology. We just need to get that silver bullet. We can get it right. Actually, nothing that is safe has been developed as yet to capture carbon in any meaningful way. This is what this guy is saying, Kevin Anderson. There's been a litany of technocratic frauds. But at the same time, we haven't tried real mitigation, real cutting of CO2 emissions. Long-term targets that are being set are undermining real mitigation. Policymakers are relying on negative emissions, technologies that don't even exist. This is the situation we face. Scientists are self-censoring. Now, Kate Marvel is a very important voice, a philosophical voice, a physics theorist. And this is what she has to say. She's from NASA's Goddard Institute. From what we can expect in the future from human activities. To be a climate scientist is to be an active participant in a slow motion horror story. We are inevitably sending our children to live on an unfamiliar planet. As a climate scientist, I am often asked to talk about hope, particularly in the current political climate. Audience want to be told that everything will be all right in the end. Climate change is bleak. The organizers always say, tell us a happy story, give us hope. The problem is, I don't have any. The opposite of hope is not despair. It is grief. Even while resolving to limit the damage, we can mourn. And here, the sheer scale of the problem provides a perverse comfort. We are in this together. I'm starting to get a bit upset myself. The swiftness of the change, its scale and inevitability binds us into one. Broken hearts trapped together under a warming atmosphere. We need courage, not hope. Grief, after all, is the cost of being alive. We are all fated to live lives shot through with sadness and are not worth less for it. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. Stephen Jenkinson talks of our deathphobic culture. He's arguing our dying times becomes an opportunity to live well if we pay attention to how precious life is. We come to peace when we understand life is far bigger than any of us as individuals. We can begin to understand our role in life when we dedicate our life to service of life, as we join a worthy line of ancestors. In ancient cultures, they talk about securing life for several generations ahead. In the face of biological annihilation, it is our obligation to face the grief and then decide how to act. It's a big shift. It's a big shift away from our individualist way of life, our consumerism. What do I need? What does my family need? How do I hang on to my privilege? And so on and so on. Acceptance that this is a time of grief means that we can begin to appreciate the beauty of life, that we can still keep ourselves strong and healthy to face this future. It's a shift we make into a step into service. It's a big emotional and liberating shift. We need a complete shift in a whole number of polluting industries into industries which can produce the buses, the trams, the trains, the turbines, the solar panels, and all the other things that society needs, the carbon capture technology in order to avert this huge threat which faces our humanity. We've done it before, we can do it again. We need the approach of a war economy, and it's only the state that's able to command that level of resources, that type of shift in society. It's going to have to be a rapid transition. It cannot be done over decades and decades. It's got to be done very quickly. The only force to do it, unfortunately, is our governments. As individuals, we don't need to stand by. We don't need bystanders. We're holding this meeting because we're looking for people who are willing to stand up, to make the sacrifices that are required as we go forward over the next few years. We need to mobilize at least 3.5% of our population in one way or the other. In South Africa, that is a couple of million people at least. This is an emergency, and we only need a few thousand people willing to get themselves involved in civil disobedience, face arrest and possible jail time. That's the good news, I'm afraid. We will need thousands of people supporting those few thousand people with legal, with media, with fundraising. The plan for us is to escalate our activity, to build for a rebellion. Because when a government is actively promoting the gassing of the world and driving extinction events, what should our response be? The policy has failed. The environmental NGOs have failed to keep these governments down to the targets we need. We are moving at present above the 1.5%, 1.5 centigrade. When XR say this is beyond politics, they're saying this has become a moral question. When the Nazis gassed and killed and exterminated millions of Soviet prisoners, millions of gypsies, Romas, millions of Jews, millions of Russian soldiers, it was considered a crime against humanity. We're talking about our whole planet being gassed. 6 billion people losing their lives. This is a moral question. It's beyond politics. And therefore, the left wing have an understanding of what rebellion is. And many of the people in this room are quite left wing. I know them. And why we need rebellion or revolution. But the right wing also have their own understanding. Locke, a liberal, says if governments cannot secure the security and livelihoods of their population, then a revolution is justified. Thomas Hobbes, an arch-conservative political theorist, argues that if law and order cannot be upheld by the government, law and order is the source that government derives its power from. The moment it loses its ability to secure law and order, people have the right to overthrow that government. The Second Amendment of the United States argues essentially the same thing. Leading Republicans in the United States have gone on the stage and spoken to climate change activists, and they have asked for them to build the barricades and to lead rebellions, to lead a revolt about what's happening, because the future of our future generation, our children and our grandchildren, will be living in horrendous times. So, we feel no qualms about calling for a rebellion. We have no qualms in getting arrested. We have no qualms in calling for an assembly of people that is elected democratically to break the impasse that the politicians are faced with. They have been immobilized. They are not doing what they need to do. We have to turn it over to the people. A citizens' assembly was called in the UK, which involved thousands upon thousands of people to discuss and plan what the future of one sector of the national healthcare should look like. We are asking for the same thing worldwide to happen, to take it out of the hands of the politicians and to put it in the hands of the people, to work out what that transition will look like in reality. It needs thousands upon thousands of people who can critically reflect and work out a way forward. John Lennon is saying essentially, violent direct action plays into the hands of the system. You will be arrested and jailed for long periods of time. You will be demonized. You cannot play their game. You're playing into their hands. The only thing they don't know how to handle is non-violence and humor. Civil disobedience. There's a long history of this. Our own Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, the suffragettes, XR in London, James Hansen himself, the author, the famous NASA climate scientist in the corner, courting arrest, the author of the book, which I would highly recommend, The Storms of Our Grandchildren, the future storms of our grandchildren. The willingness of people to go to jail solicits support. When people realize others are willing to go to jail, they want to find out why. The concept of backfiring. When people see others being arrested over issues that they know need addressed, they often turn against those that are ordering the arrests. The data tells us that violent direct action turns people away from good causes. But we are finalising what our exact demands are. That will be based on our local demands, in particular on some keen researchers. As I say, we have some top people have joined our ranks. We need questions answered about when do we go to net zero emissions? What is the slice of our remaining carbon budget? We have our own day of action coming up in October, and I think that will be a non-violent direct action day. We will be participating in the Jobs Summit, well, the Counter Summit, which is being held down the road from the official Jobs Summit in November. And we will be participating in the protest action organised by the Alternative Job Summit outside the official Job Summit. We are demanding 1 million climate jobs. We will be supporting the International Day of Action during the Conference of Parties, I believe, which is scheduled for December 6. We've been inspired by XR UK and in particular, a rather rapid winning of the local demand for a climate emergency to be declared by the government. That has been followed by a whole set of councils, big city councils in the UK. We can do the same here. I want to end with this last slide. Ethics based on virtues are critical in this age. What does it mean to live a good life in these times? We need to embrace practical wisdom. We need to follow our hearts. We need to do what is morally right. We need to do the right thing. And again, to quote Kate Marvel, courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of an happy ending. We are in need of living our lives as well as we can in the face of some terrible prospects. It means us being good ancestors for those who are to follow. It means dedicating ourselves to a life of service. I ask you today, if people have heard this talk, and after listening to this talk, whether you can continue to talk to your children about the future, continue to look at them in the eye when you talk to them about the future and their future. Your children, your grandchildren, your younger brothers and sisters, our nieces and nephews, our neighbours' children. We know what is right. Now we must do it, and we must do it together. Thank you.